Gee, thank you for that, Linda. Can folks in the back hear me okay without the microphone? Okay. In that case, I can probably step away from here sometimes, which I like. Thanks to D&R Greenway for having me here. This is absolutely great. And thanks for the turnout we have today and the partner, PEI and Hollywell, to put this together. So, the talk I want to give today is going to be a little unusual for me. It's actually new material, and it's going to be partly autobiographical. And I've always hesitated doing it. I've never done that in my writing either. And I feel a little bad because you are a captive audience, and I kind of like to have you here for my slideshow of my life. If it gets bad, just start, doing something. But it's great to be back because I am from New Jersey, originally from Mount Laurel. I spent all my life here up until just about 10 years ago. And it's an odd career trajectory. I was at Rutgers. I was doing a terminal MA, working at night. I was supposed to write a 30-page MA thesis. And my advisor went away for a year, and I told her I would just send her a little bit every time that I finished something. And a year later, I had written 300 pages. So she suggested I send that away for consideration as a book, and it actually got published as a book called Milton and Ecology. And at that time I thought maybe I should reconsider what I was doing because I very much enjoyed being a cabinet maker, and I've done it all my life. My dad was a furniture maker. I was in business with my brother. But I was deeply committed to the idea that I could do something to help environmentally. And it's sort of counterintuitive, maybe, that I went into English. You would think I would have gone into the sciences or something. But hopefully, after today, you'll get a little bit of better feeling for why that works. So the other autobiographical thing is, that's one side of my family. My dad was the furniture maker. My mother's side of the family were farmers. So I lived on what was my grandfather's farm, which my two uncles had. And it was a produce farm. And it was what's known as a truck farm. I don't know if people know exactly what that is, so I'm going to give a little background on what a truck farm is. But since I do historical analysis, my background's going to go way back, 2,000 years. Rome has this amazing distinction in Western civilization to be the first city that hit a population of 1 million people. That wouldn't happen for almost 2,000 years later in London, which I want to talk about as the next one. But when it hit that population, and growing up to that population, it needed to have, when this HVAC goes on, if you still can't hear me, let me know, okay? Still okay? When it hit that population, it created a whole nest of problems. How do you support a population that size? It was an extraordinary accomplishment to do that in a completely pre-industrial society. But as you know, there is this amazing infrastructure in Rome. These roadways, one for Europe, amazing. Of course, the waterways, aqueducts, just advanced, for their time. But the thing most people don't think about with this, and this is what I want to talk about today with respect to land use and preservation, is food production and farming. And the difficulty is, to understand something like that, it's hard to look at physical evidence. So most historians, if you're interested in roadway, it's easy. You can see the roads. If you're an archaeologist or you do physical anthropology, you can do a dig and you can find out where roads were, where aqueducts were, whatever. But how do you know exactly how people were producing food? What kind of crops they were doing? What were the practices they were doing? Physical anthropology, traditional history can help a little bit with that. This is where people like me come on the scene. Because I am a cultural historian, but I work with textual material. So most people, when they hear that I work with text and history, they just assume I do things like read Shakespeare and Milton, which I in fact do. But as cultural historians, we look at all texts. Any text is up for grabs. And text can tell you things that you can't necessarily find out from physical, history. A case in point would be agriculture, would be food production. So it's provocative to think that the first connected piece of Latin prose, the first Latin book, the first Roman book, is by a guy named Cato, and it's a farming manual. And that farming manual comes about 160 years before the Christian era. It's a seminal book to understanding how Latin works, how the culture works. More than that, how the culture functioned as far as food production, land use, and all. It would be followed just maybe 130 years later by another book. The first one by Cato is called On Agriculture. It's a rough translation out of Latin. The one that comes 130 years later is by Varro, also called On Agriculture. And it's fascinating to look at because from the point of view of a cultural historian like me, it tells you what kind of things people were doing, what kind of crops they were growing, what they thought about what they were doing, their relationship to animals and all. And this is where, from my point of view, it's so interesting why I went into this, was because it promises a different window onto history. It's not just that it records what people were doing, but it records what people were thinking about what they were doing. And in the case of Cato and Varro, it's fascinating to think about because they were the first large-scale market farmers. And, you know, how do you feed a population of 1 million people? Especially when you have a constraint. If you want to bring produce in, you know, you're limited by horse and cart to bring it in. This is before metal or rubber wheel carts. I mean, you have wooden carts with horses trying to bring food in. And the solution that they came up with, which is still with us today, that in fact was resurrected in the last decade or two with farmers markets, is highly intensive market gardening everywhere around the city where you could grow. Small plots of land where you could grow food, bring it right into the city and feed a city that way. It's also interesting to think about, just as kind of an aside, but it's an important component of this, is that this was large scale. We often think of the growth of the modern agricultural business and machine as sort of a post-World War II thing. If you've read Michael Pollan, like Michael Pollan, we've had him in Santa Barbara a number of times. I did sabbatical at Berkeley. He's a great guy. But you may get the impression from reading Michael Pollan or other environmentalists, even going back to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, you might get the idea that prior to 1945 or so, we lived in sort of a very pastoral country. It was very simple. You have large-scale agricultural business. But the fact is, if you look at Varro, 2,000 years ago, it was big business. It was large scale. To give one example, and this also gives you an insight, or a couple different insights into how they thought about the environment and animals in particular, that Varro suggests a plan for poultry raising. At the time they didn't have chickens. Chickens are a later thing in the West, but pigeons are what they raised. Varro's plan is for a building not unlike this, where 5,000 pigeons are raised at a time. It's large scale. That's just one example of the sort of large scale farming that's been done literally for thousands of years. Why this is interesting, you might have been able to find this out from like just an historical, a dig, look at the building or something, but we see from Cato and Varro their perception of animals, their perception of livestock, what they think. And honestly, it's not a very good picture. So for example, because they are intent on utilizing the land as much as they possibly can, utilizing all resources as much as they can. For example, with pigeons, their method of getting pigeons as fat as they can be, so you can take them to the market and get more for them, is to, as soon as they start having their normal adult feathers, to break their legs so they can't move around. If you think that this is new, modern agribusiness, it's been around for a long time. And it's actually especially disturbing because in Varro, there's also the clear, and this is what people like me do, we look for these things, clear indication that he understood that they were sentient feeling beings. And how he knew this was because they were in a building like this, pigeons were around, early practices, they would kill the pigeons right in the building. They discovered, Varro writes about this in detail, if you're a farmer, don't do that, because the pigeons then will realize why they're there, they'll realize they're going to be killed, they will get sad, they will get depressed, they won't eat as much, and they won't be as large. So it's a frightening commentary on what happens when you think too much about being efficient agriculturally. But again, this is not a new thing. This has been around forever. I could give you other examples going back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, which goes back 3,000 years before, although Gilgamesh's city, Uruk, doesn't have these same kind of large-scale issues. They won't occur again until London in the year 1800. London is the second European city to hit a population of 1 million. And the situation happens again, but in a very modern way. And this is why people like me are interested in it. What I mean by that is you have a population of 1 million people, and it grew very quickly. From the year 1500 to 1700, for example, the population of London likely grew tenfold. By the time you get to 1800, when it hits 1 million, it's just been this incredible sort of meteoric rise in population. But the same issue, again, pre-industrial society, they're using some proto-industrial practices, sort of hinting at what's going to come with the so-called Industrial Revolution. But the issue is, how do you feed all these people? And in a very modern way, in the 17th century, the British began working out modern farming practices. And these practices, sometimes they're disturbing like Varro, but for the most part, they're not. But what they're doing is laying the groundwork for a series of revolutions that we will call sometimes the Green Revolution. But crop yield starts rising dramatically. In part, becomes an issue with land preservation because in the year 1500, there are probably no more than 200 new species in England. They're being brought in from the New World. But by the year 1700, 200-year window goes from 200 introduced species to 20,000. Things are being brought in some ways that are considered miracle crops. One great example is the potato. Potato is largely introduced by Sir Walter Raleigh. Raleigh also has the distinction of introducing tobacco, which was a problem. And just as an aside, if you're interested in the sort of material history of things like that, as early as right after Elizabeth's reign, 1603, people are beginning to rail against tobacco as being a problem. People know that it's bred. James I, Elizabeth's successor, writes a tract telling people don't use tobacco, it's going to kill you. It's 400 years ago. Anyhow, at this time though, people were trying to figure out how to be efficient in growing crops. Not just in the big sort of agribusiness way we would think today, of monocrops and all, but if you have this huge population and you have to get crops to them, you only can bring it in by way of a horse. How can you use every little pocket of land in the most efficient possible way? And the way you would do this, and now I'm speaking having grown up as a farmer, and also I should mention, as an aside too, I'm a kind of an avid urban farmer back in Santa Barbara. My wife has finally accepted the fact that I've ripped up all the lawn and put in raised beds everywhere, and we now have chickens walking around our backyard. But the practice that they came up with, which was to intercrop, to put a variety of different crops in the same spaces, to have crops, one crop that would go through crops. Some crops, as you may know, grow very quickly. Radishes grow like in a month. Corn and all can take 3 or 4 months. But to have multiple crops. Also, they thought of ways of putting in things like raised beds with glass on the top. Glass was coming into widespread use because of new industrial practices that allowed larger panes of glass. And what that meant was they had like little greenhouses that farmers used. We still use these today. You may know these as cold frames. So this was the first modern implementation of what is now known as bio-intensive gardening. If you're a vegetable gardener, you may hear this phrase. It's kind of a big deal. Most people would not think that it goes back to the Renaissance, and part of my work has been making clear that it does. Most people think it goes back to France, by the way, and the same basic story happens again. It is not Rome or London's population that grows sort of meteoric rise, but it's in fact Paris. So Paris has this large population. This is an era where Paris comes much after London, but this is an era where trains are starting to come into use, but again, the same problem again and again. How do you get crops, produce, into an area that's growing this large? In a way, it becomes the cap for why these cities can't grow larger. There are some that do, but not in the West. Baghdad, actually, will grow to 2 million long before London hits 1 million. But it's ultimately an environmental issue regarding land use and food as to why this happens. Bio-intensive gardening is usually attributed to, as I suggested, Paris. It comes around right at the middle of the 19th century. I'm beginning to move towards my own autobiography here. So, my grandfather was in Germany born in Germany at the end of the 19th century, was aware of these new practices, came to the United States because he wasn't the oldest son, he wasn't going to inherit land. The United States had the potential of having land everywhere. So came here originally into the Philadelphia area where he worked on a farm, ultimately as sort of the foreman for a few years until he was able to buy a farm in southern New Jersey. Now, what's interesting about this is a shift had taken place that hadn't happened for 2,000 years, but was primed to happen because of a major technological innovation, which was not the train or the car, but the truck. So, the problem with Rome, the problem with Paris, the problem with London, horse and cart meant you could only go so far out. Those were called market gardens. If you look at them in English, it's called market. If you look at it in French, it's called market. If you look at it in Latin, it's usually called market. But suddenly, the possibility opens up in the beginning of the 20th century to move out a little further and to start something that were known as truck farms. They really are the inheritor of the market farm. And what happened in my grandfather's case was, it wasn't that he was that much of an innovator. I think he realized that this social technological change had happened, and he wanted to be one of the folks that took advantage of it. So places like Mount Laurel were wonderfully positioned to do this. Mount Laurel wouldn't have worked as an area to bring something into Philadelphia by way of a horse-drawn cart. It was too far. But it worked out perfectly for a truck that doubled that range. So market gardening increased into truck gardening, and for my family, for my mother's family, it was perfectly situated. So having a large family, she was from a family of 9, my uncles became hucksters. And hucksters were guys who literally took the produce into town in a truck and sold it literally on the streets. So we have farmers markets now that are on the streets. So these are actually trucks that came stopped and things were sold that way. It's a fascinating moment of history because of these things and how they shifted because of technology, and it opened up a window that lasted for a while and was very successful. The difficulty is, historically, this came to an end because of a number of other technological innovations. One was transportation, not only trucks, but other transportation was increasing in a big way. Rail was becoming a thing, so suddenly you could not only bring things 40 miles by truck, you could bring them 400 miles. Even as early as Shakespeare's England, boats were increasingly a thing. So you could buy, in Shakespeare's England, a banana or an orange. It was possible because they were being brought in from the so-called New World at the time. This began to change things dramatically through the 1930s and 40s, culturally. Also, refrigeration had a big role to play in this too. Suddenly, you didn't have to worry about rushing the product into town in one day, either on a horse-drawn cart or a truck. You could take your time in getting things there longer. It could be frozen. What that meant was that what had seemed like this perfect way of farming that had started with the growth of all large European cities, and starts again and again. It starts with Rome, and it happens again with London, it happens with Paris, and it happened too with Philadelphia. So Philadelphia had the same sort of meteoric growth, but even more. So I mentioned that London's population, I said, grows tenfold and then even larger to 1 million by 1800. It took it 300 years to go from a population of 40,000 to a population of 1 million. Philadelphia went from the year 1800 to 1890 to the same exact thing. It became a city of 1 million again. So that put in place the necessity for people like my grandfather to have farms. The new type of mechanized farm, truck farm, which was the innovation on market farming, was just perfectly positioned for that. And Mount Laurel and the areas that sort of went around the city became perfectly situated for that too. The unfortunate thing, of course, is you might think if you read Michael Pollan, like The Omnivore's Dilemma, that it was a change in farming practices, the growth of monocultures, this sort of huge farms that we have out in the Midwest that are owned by huge conglomerates. That had a role to play in it, But it's also the case that changing practices, people being able to buy food that was frozen, food that was being brought in, and also the growth of not monocultures, but focusing on particular types of food. So Mount Laurel, southern New Jersey, a major part of that was the very famous New Jersey tomato, Jersey tomatoes. So in Campbell Soup set up a plant in Camden, New Jersey, which was one of the largest soup manufacturing plants, tomato soup manufacturing plants in the world. And all over the world, Jersey tomatoes went by way of Campbell Soup. And when that started happening, it also changed what was working with farmers. But by the time I was a child, that way of life was completely ending. And this is where we're going to get into kind of land use here in Mount Laurel. It was sad to see, I should say, and I do write on pastoral, and I do think about, you know, what happened then. But when I was a child, even though my grandfather was quick to adopt things like tractors and all, we still had the last of our two workhorses. They were up until I was 6 years old, Kitty and Dolly, who were named after the sisters from Anna Karenina, the sister Chaturbakaya. And I was very sad, apparently. I forget, I was 6 years old when we got rid of the horses, but I know I was so upset that my parents actually bought me a horse, and apparently that was really pretty cool. I named the horse Joe. I guess I didn't have quite the imaginative energy at that time. So what happened was, increasingly, as these farming practices changed, it meant in towns like Mount Laurel that farming stopped being viable, and it was very sad. It happened for different reasons, and again, cultural historians like myself, this is what we look at. Different reasons than the growth of monoculture and all, has to do with the way cities were spreading and all at the time. And it unfortunately just wasn't working by the 1960s. And it was the case for a lot of farmers in New Jersey at that time. And a viable option suddenly became selling to developers. When I was born on the farm in Mount Laurel. There were no road developments in Mount Laurel. The first major one, Bramblewood, came in when I was a child, but before that, it was entirely a farming community. In fact, it didn't even have a town center. We didn't even have our own post office for a while. We all went through Morristown. But it was just a farming community. It was just designed to be what this was, which was a way of supplying produce directly into a place like Philadelphia. It's unfortunate because the interest in organic farming now, the interest in market farming, the interest in going to a farmer's market may well have allowed that to continue, but it didn't. This would kind of be an uninteresting story. Maybe it already is an uninteresting story. But there's something bizarre happened with this one little farm, and this is where it taps into land use. My uncle sold the farm in the 1960s, and when they were looking around for a developer, they were very upset by development. I mean, they didn't want to sell, but it just wasn't viable for them to keep doing it. And of course, you know, we're coming out in the 1940s and 50s. Levittown, PA is not far from here. There's this sort of, you know, overwhelming sense of suburbia and sort of regular housing. They didn't like that model. They didn't like the idea of having what Bramblewood, the first community there was this idea of a country club community. So Bramblewood had its own golf course. It was originally 18 holes, it went to 27, had a swimming pool and all that. They didn't like that model either. So what they wanted to do, their hope was that even though their farm was going to end, their father's farm was going to end, that it could stay on as farms, that it would be sold as little farmettes. It would be lots that would be sufficient so that people could actually have horses there. The developer signed a contract with them that he was going to keep the barn. And being in this barn today very much reminds me of that, because it was the largest barn in Mount Laurel, and it was a lot like this barn. And that all sounded good. And this is an interesting twist here that shows an issue regarding when culture and environment comes together. Because the little farm became a footnote in history. Because it was that farm, that particular farm, bought by Hamanian Brothers Construction that became the contested space for the Mount Laurel 1 decision. Mount Laurel 2 decision came out of that. Right now, the whole, I'm sure if you're familiar with New Jersey, you know the Mount Laurel decision. And in part, it came out of this desire, which was almost this sort of proto-environmental desire on the part of my uncles to keep this a viable farm-type place. They didn't mean to be exclusionary. And in fact, the NAACP actually had the case against Mount Laurel rather than the developer, and they were actually, used as the person that was contested there was Ethel Lawrence, which is actually a friend of my mother from childhood. They went to school together. So it was never meant to do that, but it shows the conflict that comes in when environmental issues and cultural issues collide together. Now, unfortunately, what happened in Mount Laurel, and I'm kind of stepping aside as an academic, which is sort of, speaking from the heart, was a total mess, what happened there. The growth in Mount Laurel and that model, which now environmentalists are increasingly looking at, the suburban model, the suburban sprawl, that generated Mount Laurel directly as being environmentally just the wrong model altogether. So, Mount Laurel is 22 square miles. As it turns out, if you back out Central Park, Manhattan is 22 square miles. Manhattan is increasingly everyone's go-to model now for the way that we should live. It's hard to think about if we're used to the idea we want to live in suburbs, used to the idea we want to live in rural areas. If you look at life in Manhattan from an environmental point of view, it's the way to go. Typically, for example, only 18% of people in Manhattan get to where they're going by way of car. A place like Mount Laurel, it's got to be well into the 90s at this point. If you look at the size of houses in Mount Laurel, these sort of trophy houses that have become the thing, big houses with 3-car garages and all, they're using 3, 4, 5 times more energy across the board than you would in something like Manhattan. And the irony is, and this is where culture comes into play, if it had not worked out that way, if cities had grown, and they grew in Rome, they grew in London, they grew in Paris, they grew in Philadelphia, in many cases in pre-industrial societies, there wasn't any super magic environmentally that would make these things work. They did work, they were efficient, and in fact, ringing them with the sort of farms that they had, everyone thinks now, or many people think, I write about this, that was the way to do it environmentally. It would have meant that there would be places like here, that everywhere around here would have been what it is and what it should have been. I mean, New Jersey, southern New Jersey is a vast tidal plain. It's their aquifers, you just dig down into the ground, you get irrigation directly. If you look at irrigation where I am in Southern California, in Santa Barbara, it's a huge problem agriculturally. That problem wouldn't have existed here. Southern New Jersey, which is ideally situated to serve what it did, Philadelphia and New York City, as these sort of growing industrial areas. But that's what happened. So, in many respects, that's where we are. And this is me being autobiographical. This led me to the kind of work that I do. And when I write about what I do, I always am thinking, about Mount Laurel. It's always the case. In fact, in my first book, it was so transparent that I didn't tell anyone how transparent it was, but before I decided to make this jump and do this new career, I had been writing sort of autobiographical theoretical essays, sort of environmental essays about the way we should live and all, and I talked about my own experience. In a couple cases, I grabbed paragraphs and cut and pasted them into a book on Milton and talked about Eve's experience exactly as my own because it was kind of the same. And if you're not familiar with Milton's Paradise Lost, Eve laments the fact that Eden has been destroyed. Something has happened to destroy Eden. The place that she knew, cared about, and loved is no longer there. That has always been, I think, my story too. And it's always sort of in the back of my mind. And what Linda suggested I was going to start talking, what I would talk about is coming out of that. So I do work with Rome, but the principal city that I'm interested in is not Philadelphia, which probably should be what I'm writing about, and how it impacted places like Mount Laurel, but London, and Shakespeare's London. Shakespeare's London, 400 years ago, so many of the issues that we are wrestling with today came up there. And they came up in ways that, we should have known. We should have realized that they were going to be an issue, and we just haven't been paying attention to it. And I think now, finally, scholars are coming around to it. I'll give an example. Air pollution. Urban air pollution now, obviously, if you've watched, can't avoid seeing the news the last few months in Beijing, the problem of it. That problem has been happening again and again for 400 years. It starts in Shakespeare's England. By the time Milton is writing Paradise Lost in 1667, respiratory disease caused by air pollution is probably the second leading cause of the death in the city, second only to the plague. And the reason for that, and this is why it is a cautionary tale, is because people were using fossil fuels at an unprecedented way. And again, it has to do with cities, the growth of cities. So London grows to a city of 1 million. Most people are burning wood as it's growing. They no longer have, huge beams like this because they deforested the area entirely around London. The solution at the time is to bring in coal. Coal comes in from places like Newcastle. It's called sea coal because it's brought in from the coast. Even then, it's pre-industrial society. They had barges going up the Thames that carry 170 tons worth of coal. And people were burning it not for industrial practice, and that's what's so interesting about what's happening there. If we think that something like the growth of fossil fuel use happens with the so-called industrial revolution, steam engines and all that, it starts before that. People were burning it because people needed it for their own uses. They were not, the energy efficiency of the houses was very low. People were burning it for their own stoves, for their own fireplaces and all. In fact, the fireplace actually emerges during that period because prior to burning coal, people liked the smell of wood smoke. They didn't see it as a problem. So most country houses especially had gabled roofs with a little opening at one end, and that smoke literally went out there. So the fireplace that you would have actually been a place on the floor for the fire. And you would have just made your fire there, would have been under the hole and went out. That didn't work for coal. People then wanted to build fireplaces and chimneys, and then stoves came into use to just get it out of the room because it was so noxious. And people realized it was killing them. In London, around there, everything that happens, so much of what happens first happens there. So air pollution is one example. Another example would be radical changes in land use, radical loss of wilderness spaces. That's why London is such a fascinating place to look at and why people like me look at it, because, we might want to think now globally. We might want to think about the effect of all that we do, how it affects the far reaches of the planet, things that we do right here. London is a great case study because it was a little island, because it was an island, it was isolated in some respects, and these problems all emerged there. So for example, we now are in direct control of perhaps 85% of the Earth's landmass. Well, England was well in control of 85% of its land by the time Shakespeare was writing. And as a consequence, land use was changing dramatically. People wanted to eradicate wilderness at that time. Wilderness didn't make sense to people. So there were people known, ironically, as undertakers, and they were called undertakers because they undertook a project to restore land. And how they did that is, if there was swampland or anything of that sort that wasn't arable or couldn't be used for pastures, they undertook projects to drain the land. They actually brought in engineers coming in from Holland who have been very successful building dikes and draining land. So they did that. So systematically, they began eradicating indigenous plants, putting in new agricultural practices. The difficulty is, if it had just been to feed people, that might have been sufficient. But the problems that we have today, for something like biofuel, where we want to grow products not for foodstuffs, but for other uses, was a big thing then. So it's not that they wanted it for biofuel, but they wanted the oil from things like rapestone and other crops to be able to put through an industrial process and create oils that they used for industry. They needed to make rope, like manila rope and all. You needed oil to do that. So vast areas were being converted into a different type of agriculture for different practices. The difficulty here is that in addition to this happening, there's something else that was big that actually has been driving like a locomotive into the 21st century, and it shows no sign of stopping. And that is, as the colonial project took off, where England suddenly, as you know, this power all over the world. And furthermore, as proto-industrial practices, long before the steam engine, people in England were doing things like making textiles and all by hand. What it meant was there was a growing group of people who were making a lot of money, who were aggregating money together. And what those people wanted to do was to show that they were wealthy. So traditionally in England, you know, there's landed gentry, there's a group of people that have aggregated wealth together, and there are, if you watch a movie like Pride and Prejudice, like Mr. Darcy or something, this is someone who has it for generations and generations. Well, there's a new group coming on the scene, nouveau riche, newly rich. They want to show people what they have. They want to prove that they're every bit as sort of credible as the older money, and they began building their own palatial estates. And it happens right around London. As early as 1611, Ben Jonson, Amelia Lanier, maybe 5 years later, starts railing against this development. They say this is absolutely the wrong way that people should live. Ben Jonson starts saying things like, you know, these houses, what are they built for? They're built for show. They're built to prove that you're wealthy. Do they have any other use? And he writes a wonderful poem called The Penshurst. And it's actually about, relatively speaking, a much more modest house. And he says this should be the ideal, smaller house. Penshurst is not that small by itself, but the underlying thinking becomes enormously influential over 250 years later, no, not 250 actually, 240 years later, with Henry David Thoreau, who takes that thinking to his logical conclusion and says, if we only need a house big enough for us, what should that be? And he comes to the conclusion, basically the size of a garden shed, 10 by 15 feet. But what happens is, this movement that starts in England, it's not just in England, and you can trace it back further. You can trace it back, you can always go back to Rome or further back. But in a modern sense, it starts in England, it starts in Italy and France as well. The idea that you have an estate, that the estate has grounds, garden with it, and the big innovation here is that you have grass. You have big expanses of grass, you have topiaries with it. This model roars through the next 3 or 4 centuries, and it's remembered as an icon of what people want. So when people start building houses, outside of cities, they adopt this model. They don't adopt the city model. The city model, you know, it's always been congested. It's always been congested. But that's not been a bad thing. There were wonderful urban planners in the 1950s and 1960s anyhow, who realized that this was the way that things needed to be done, greater density. But that efficient, environmentally, what we now know as environmentally efficient model was not on anybody's mind at the time. And this is what's so interesting about this from my point of view. Because if you go back, and this is the way that Linda introduced me, if you go back 400 years ago, you can see this thing started. It's just this odd idea that this is what it means to be wealthy, that this is how you should show your wealth. And this continues forward, and somehow along the line gets so distilled and almost all life out of it, yet still emerges in suburbia after the Second World War in the United States. It emerges again in Mount Laurel. It's not the trophy houses of 1611, but the prodigy houses that were built there were built on this model. They had the same exact purpose in mind. And it's just startling because environmentally, it's just a catastrophe. And it didn't need to be a catastrophe because we've known since Rome, since London, that there were ways around this. There were problems with it. And in Milton's London, Shakespeare's London, they knew what those problems were. And for example, with coal, it emerges as a problem. It's a very localized problem in a global sense. It's just around sort of London. A few other cities it becomes an issue. But they already started implementing ways of taking care of this. So, for example, you may think, most people do, that the world is in a period of deforestation now. We are not. We've been in a period of reforestation on a global level for well over a century now. That began in Milton and Shakespeare's England. France especially leads the world in reforestation practices then. Those reforestation practices are swept through Europe into North America, and they continue today. It's only really in like the Amazonian basin and parts of Indonesia where we have wholesale deforestation on a level that is that's really significant compared to the reforestation efforts. So even though the problems existed way back, there were attempts at solutions to them. And furthermore, there were people at the time, so flash forward a little from Shakespeare and Ben Jonson and Amelia Lanier, who are like the beginning of the 17th century, toward the third quarter of the century. People like Andrew Marvell, you may know him from high school. Marvell wrote a wonderful series of poems called the Mower Poems. And in the Mower Poems, he rails against introduced species. He rails against losing indigenous plants. Specifically, at this time, it was a real trend, a real fad, that if you had one of these palatial estates, you wanted to have a really cool garden. And a really cool garden at this point would have seemed very artificial. And you would want not to bring, consequently, indigenous plants into it. It would not work. But, you have all these plants coming from all over the world, not only the so-called New World, Africa. Holland had a huge industry, even back then, bringing tulips in. Andrew Marvell says that, and he's probably right, historians have looked carefully at what he says, that you would have to sell literally an acre of farmland to buy some of the most expensive orchids at the time. Because, not orchids, but tulips at the time. Because it was a real technological or agricultural innovation to be able to create a perfect white tulip at the time. Everyone wanted them. So these practices at the time were even seen to be problematic. But unfortunately, and this is what people like me try to figure out, is what happened to allow the momentum of this to go forward. There have been people all along, and talk about Ben Jonson, talking about Amelia Lanier. You could go back, and you could go back to Cato and Varro and look at one of their contemporaries, Horace. Horace had major problems with that sort of affectation as well. Henry David Thoreau is the best example, but there are a ton of others throughout the 18th, 19th, and 20th century who thought about more radical, for lack of a better way of putting a footprint on the planet. It's just that we haven't listened to them. So what people like me try to do, people like myself try to do, is to get at exactly what these practices are and to try to unpack them a little more. And that's why something like a focus on the city is so important, and why it is sometimes a little counterintuitive, because if you hear that I do environmental criticism, I look at literature, you would probably assume I do something like look at poetry that celebrates nature, maybe like Wordsworth or something. But in fact, I often look at texts that aren't very poetic or very artistic, but also focused on the city. Because cities are really the place to look at, both for emerging problems because of population density and practices, but then also ultimately solutions to the problem, which is the confusing thing. So often people assume that cities are the problem. They just seem like sort of a nexus of environmental problems. But increasingly it's the case that they're just not. If you look at, you actually break down energy consumption. You can do this today, you can do it 400 years ago, and the greater density of cities regarding transportation, regarding heat, regarding everything, it's just far better. So it's kind of a long-winded way of talking about what is in a way, personal to me, because it's a life that I lived and I saw it in a place like Mount Laurel, which today has very little green space left, and in part because of what happened there, which really didn't have to happen and happen the way it did. It's unfortunate, it's easy to now look back in retrospect and understand the cultural environmental, agricultural, industrial practices that brought it about. And they're complicated, but it's just so lamentable that it happened. And it's so lamentable that we didn't catch up to a mentality that would have stopped it until it was already done with. You know, so my family's farm, extending really into the 1970s before it got fully built out, was just so close to catching on to this new movement of interest in local and organic and market gardens. Market gardens have come back again, and yet it just wasn't sufficient for so many places. And furthermore, the general acceptance of these things hasn't quite caught on yet. I think that's what's so frustrating and yet maybe encouraging, that there is a trend that is happening now, but it's slowly happening, and unfortunately development is slowed down a little because of the economic downturn, but it is coming back again. So it may not, these two trends may not be sufficient to the trend in interest again in farmland may not be quite enough to stop what's happening, but we can kind of hope that it will. So, questions? I know I just threw a lot of material out at you. So, Ellen.
So you sort of identified the lust for conspicuous or ostentatious consumption, showy in one's housing as one of the sources of a destructive trend in land development in the 17th century. But in the U.S., and some of that is clear in the U.S. also, but wouldn't you also attribute part of it to a kind of yearning for the rustic tradition in the U.S., where we think we're, on our acre and a half or 2 acres that we're using up, we're, on our little tractors and playing farmer or being rustic, almost Thoreauish.
So Linda mentioned that my most recent book is called What Else is Pastoral? And it's about the pastoral impulse that really goes back 3,000 years in Western culture. And in a way, it's what's lurking behind it in a strange way culturally is first, in Greek thinking, the idea of a golden age, that there was once a time where human beings lived at peace with the planet, where the planet provided for everyone, everything. And this joins up with pastoral, which is also a Greek tradition, in this case like 2,200 years old, that talked about shepherds and an earth that benevolently provided for everyone. And the idea of moving from an urban place to a pastoral place. And that's such a great point, because that has always been around. And also lurking behind there too, so that was the Greco-Roman tradition, Judeo-Christian tradition of Eden. Eden is the same thing. It's this place that constantly takes care of you. That has always been sort of a pull away from cities. People who write pastoral write it from the point of view of cities. Cities weren't always nice places. Cities, even in the second half of the 19th century, cities were bad places to live, unsafe places, sanitary conditions were low. In fact, by 1835 or so, mortality rates in cities had dropped to near plague levels from hundreds of years before. It was that bad. So people wanted to go out into what they saw as welcoming wilderness. So Thoreau is part of that movement, but Thoreau is just Thoreau is kind of the end of a 2,000-year history of that. So it's a great point, because we could talk about other things too. There are a range of different factors that do that. And in America, when Europeans first got here, we didn't quite know what to make of it. Because on the one hand, people saw it as, it's kind of scary and problematic. On the other hand, we saw it as this sort of wonderful pastoral place. There are actually depictions of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden set in the New World in the United States that had Native Americans in the background. Because initially we thought these people were living like a perfect Edenic life. Once people actually got here and started settling, they realized that wasn't the case. They no longer were thinking of it as like a new Eden. but they often, before that, did. And this whole, motion through the United States, in part, has been that. And there's a great line in a new book that came out this year called Triumph of the City. If anyone has read it, I definitely recommend it. And it's in part by a Harvard professor, who's an economist. And he's talking about, in very specific terms, why urban life is environmentally so much better than other forms of life. He has a great line in there, and he says, if you love nature, stay away from it. So if you love nature, live in Manhattan. It sounds so counterintuitive, and in part what I do is look at how people talk about the aesthetic experience of nature, and they do, Thoreau, and all of the romantics around him, Wordsworth, Shelley, Keats, they're all celebrating nature. And Wordsworth is a great example of this because he writes about the Lake District in England, which he loved. He lived in the little town of Grashmere. And people read it, they wanted to go out there, so much so that someone had the bright idea to bring a rail line out to bring all the tourists there. And Wordsworth was the first one to start protesting and said, stop, don't come out. So it's this odd idea of celebrating nature, wanting to be in nature, wanting to be in wilderness, and then also, that's kind of like the worst thing you can actually do to act on that desire. Yeah.
I'm interested to see what you think about, and I've been so perplexed by this for so long, as we try to control sprawl and preserve some of the spaces that we have left in the most populous state in the Union and maybe in the world at this point. How we do this is so unrelated to the fact that we have laws that are so weighted in favor of the property owner and not Commonwealth needs and values, and that basically what we have to do is engage ourselves in a process of spending tons of money to buy back what's left, the remains pretty much of what's left there for us to preserve. And the definition of landowner wasn't your uncles in the farm. It was whoever got the contract on a piece of land, who was definitely a land speculator. Around here, much of the acreage that's still rural around here has been in the hand of land speculators and developers for many years, and the people who are farming it are just leasing it so that the tax benefits can accrue from it and so on. Why don't we have discussion about what's wrong with our land use law?
Yeah. It's a great question, and because I'm interested in a range of things, it shows up again and again and again. I mean, in a democratic society, people make choices on things, and it often has to do with, ultimately, costs of things. So, and one of the tragedies, I think, of a place like New Jersey is because it was relatively inexpensive compared to other places. In southern New Jersey, I'm talking about. So if you look where I'm from, in like Santa Barbara, where a 3-bedroom house is like over $1 million now. The fact that it was so inexpensive here, it allowed people to have that dream. But the point is, how do you legislate people to do something that they may not want to do?
Well, I'm just curious that they're not given the choice, and I somehow it just doesn't come up. And somehow it seems like, and it's not just New Jersey, I think it's by and large the whole country, but the East Coast has pretty much made land a commodity.
Yeah.
And it wasn't like if you had a farm, you had a commodity to sell, but your land was also commodity. And so that eventually, inexorably, gets sold.
It does, but the interesting thing is, so like in Manhattan, which is the go-to example, but long before anything ever happened in Mount Laurel, Manhattan was built out the way it was. And what interests me are the cultural forces that drive us to something like Mount Laurel. Why would we want to go there to begin with? And it's those cultural reasons that are mystifying, but are so real. And so another example of them would be, why in the world would we want cars? Everyone wants a car, and I know I'm like this probably sound utopian, but the fact is, if you look at New York, it is utopian in that sense. New York is, the only other cities in the world that rival New York are places like Tokyo and all, where they've gotten rid of the need for cars. Cars are not part of that economy or ecology in any way. And yet, we've wanted them, and we wanted wilderness, we wanted to get back to Eden, we want our own palatial estate, we wanted that, and if you go to a place like Mount Laurel, there was no mass transit ever thought of when that town was built out. There's no way to get around other than by car. So it goes with it, but these are cultural preferences. And the one thing I'll say is that I find very encouraging, and I know this only through interaction with students in a new generation, they're not buying it anymore. That dream that lasted so long is one that they're increasingly rejecting and moving back to cities. And they are the last generation, the generation now and the generation right before them, they are literally re-inhabiting cities, and they're greening them in the process. And it's not always the case. I mean, these cultural trends don't just go away automatically, but you can see a countercultural trend. And in this generation, being an environmentalist, doesn't necessarily mean moving out to a commune somewhere far away. It's just the opposite. It's moving to Brooklyn and places like that, which is intriguing.
Well, my kids are
Yeah.
I have a two-parter. It's very interesting to hear you talk about Mount Laurel. I'm an attorney. I went to Rutgers Law School back in the day. And of course, Mount Laurel was, we always studied that and everything, and it was always positioned as a very democratic leveler access to housing.
Right.
And so it's an interesting take, but two things. One is, how do you reconcile the need for sort of this affordable housing and people being housed someplace, and where do you put them? And maybe urban planning wasn't the best as far as Massachusetts, but how do you reconcile that with this preservation of land and this idea of preserving the gardens and all of that? And secondly, it's interesting to hold out a place like Manhattan.
Can you repeat that?
A little louder.
It's interesting to hold out Manhattan as this mecca of this great, solution. But Manhattan now is virtually a gated community. Who can live in these cities? Kids can't even live in Brooklyn. Talk to kids who try to go even to Redwood. They can't live there. It's so expensive.
Oh, no.
Cities are nice, but hey, you can't get there.
Well, yeah, but the other boroughs are where this this is not a simple solution.
Brooklyn, no.
Yeah, well, but that's gentrifying recently, and then, Bronx and all this.
Yeah, but the places aren't gentrified. You talk about the old cities where you have the adverse health issues, the perils. That's why people move out.
Yeah, that's why.
I hear what you're saying. It's very attractive, but I really can't reconcile this whole issue of the Mount Laurel preserving the parks. Where do you put people? How do you house them? How do you reconcile it? And then this whole issue of the city is the mecca, and then how do you accommodate people going back to the city?
But they are. You know what I mean? What's happening is,
Who are they?
it also, but it's a newer generation. First off, yes, it is a gentrification that's going on too. But from a purely environmental point of view, the challenge should be to do that. The challenge should not be to figure out how to colonize, farmland, wilderness, and other places. You know what I mean? Well, but today, with the new generation of not only planners, economists and all are looking to that, and they're looking to the alternate models of urban planning that were a counterculture thing in the 1960s against what brought about what we have now. But I wouldn't count the cities out yet. I was fascinated when I drove across the country to come here from Santa Barbara. Places like Omaha and Salt Lake City, amazing renaissances going on there in those places. And where I'm used to places back on the West Coast, astonishing. What's being done in like Seattle and Portland and all. These are completely changing the way that cities have been working. So, and furthermore, if you look at, there are a number of books, but if you look at something, even like the film Urbanized, the growth of urban farming by a whole range of people, the kind of work like that Alice Waters has been pushing for and all. It seems to me that's the direction to go in. You know what I mean, for schools and all as well. I know what you're saying, and I don't want to come across here sounding utopian, but I do think the focus has to kind of shift away from places like Mount Laurel, because they won't be able to, there's none of it left anyhow. But go ahead, Steve.
I had a couple questions about lawns and yards.
It sounded like you were saying that the lawn started with vanity, as part of these large nouveau riche houses, and then that continued somehow. And I always thought there were sheep pastures and that they got converted, that we lost the utilitarian aspect and turned them into some kind of aesthetic. So I'm wondering if a couple things. One is whether the vanity has continued along with the yard, or if it's lost that vanity and just turned into like maintaining home values, and whether we need to get back to, or whether we need to get back to a utilitarian view of the yard, sort of what you're doing with your raised beds and so forth.
Yeah, it's a super complicated issue. First off, those grazing areas that you talked about were almost, not always, but for the most part, were commons. And commons have a long history in England and elsewhere. But just to go back a little further, this is why England's so interesting to think about in terms of like deforestation and growth and all. By the 11th century, 85% of England had been deforested. It swept over to Ireland as well. We call Ireland today the Emerald Island. Most people see pictures of it with those rolling grassy fields and all. That's not where it got the name originally. Originally it came from because it was a forested island. That's what it was about. And this pastoral tradition works perfectly for this, because if you leave sheep graze somewhere, nothing will grow. Sheep will literally rip it out because of it. The controversy that happens, and this happens simultaneously with the sort of growth of the sort of estate mentality, is that the commons were increasingly being privatized. And people were initially, how that worked was landowners were just kind of seizing it and taking it. Very controversial. There were riots about it. It played a role in the English Civil War in the 1840s and all, in part, because people were very unhappy about it. But then what happened was, once it was owned, then it was later sold into, like, especially in the beginning of the 20th century, into what became like housing developments and all too. But you're right. I mean, there was that pastoral element to it, but for the most part, that was like commons. But the actual area surrounding a house and all, that was pretty new. Yeah, and it was sort of proof that you had that land and you didn't need that land. And if you look at any of those sort of palatial estates, they're very careful in that their gardens and all show very little vegetable gardens. We wanted to show that. They're always decorative gardens. And we continue that today. But again, this is another thing that's changing, I mean, with urban gardening and all. When you think of urban gardening, you're not thinking of flowers anymore. Good, Holly.
Thank you so much. It's been very interesting. Toward the very end of your talk, you started discussing markets and how they are possibly coming back. And I'm just curious to have you elaborate on that a little bit more, and culturally, what more needs to happen in your perspective to make them effective, and how are they different from the markets of the past?
I think culturally, so much, that movement, people like Michael Pollan and Alice Waters, huge, and making people aware of the costs involved with what we do. So you might think that, just buying a piece of fruit in the store is the same as growing it, but, Michael Pollan's made very clear, the average fruit or vegetable to get to our table travels 1,500 miles. Michael Pollan has a great talk where he shows a Big Mac from McDonald's, and he has 2 glasses, almost this size, of oil, telling us this is how much crude oil you need to make those burgers. We may not think of it because you don't realize that it's incredibly energy intensive. I mean, growing all the corn and all that gets force fed to these animals, trucking them around and all. I think ultimately, at the end of the day, these are cultural questions. They're not technological questions. I mean, Rome is a great example. 2,000 years ago, they were working something out. It was being worked out in Manhattan in the last century. But these are cultural things. How do you tell people to eat differently? Michael Pollan is making the argument. In part, his recent work, and he just has a book that just came out, which is why he couldn't come to our conference, he's on a book tour. And, you know, he wants people to be a little self-serving maybe. You know, you could be healthier, you could be eating better and all. But if we actually are aware of the costs involved in these practices, hopefully it'll make a difference. On the other hand, it is cultural because, you know, to buy grass-fed beef or something is very expensive. So we also have to think in terms of, you know, the consumption of beef and things like that as as something to think about. But at the end of the day, that's what fascinates me from my end of it so much. There are just cultural decisions, cultural preferences that have these huge, you know, ramifications. And when we do them and they become so natural, we forget that there are decisions that were made for us. You know what I mean? Yeah.
I hear what you're saying. I think that to refer to these issues as cultural is kind of making them a little too broad-based, and that kind of washes over it, so we can sort of not be able to address it because it's too general. Because actually they're really ethical questions, and then it's not really so much as a black and white, you know, right or wrong, you know, warring different ethics, but there are many different types of ethics because there's the corporatists, there's the egalitarians, there's communitarians. So you have to sort of weigh all the different worldviews and values, you know, value orientations, and then start picking it apart and look at the different value orientations if you want to solve the problem. Instead of saying that it's just a cultural issue and making it so broad and then making everybody feel kind of weak. I'm not saying that you're doing this, but just if you say that it's a cultural problem, it kind of leaves you feeling, you know, helpless, like somebody else has to take care of it because it's such a big problem. But start picking it down into, you know, okay, it's an economic problem because there's people that the land use issue is not going to be solved that easily because people aren't farming because they're being eaten out by Monsanto and all the big corporations and this big agribusiness, and the family farms aren't making any money, so kids don't want to get into the business anymore because you can't beat the big corporation farms anymore, and they're shipping their stuff overseas anyway. So it does make a lot of sense to look at vital needs versus what everybody wants to try to live like here in this society.
yeah. But see, but it's the question of what people want to live like and why they do. And just to be clear, when I use the word cultural, I mean it in a broad sense, probably including the sense that you have too. So when you make ethical decisions, those are cultural as well. And when individuals make decisions, so when we make a decision to go buy product that is environmentally, you know, created under better conditions, that's an ethical decision, but that's a cultural decision too. And by encouraging those, what Michael Pollan is doing, what other people are doing, those are trying to shift the way the culture is moving. And, you know, I would argue, for example, because I am a big fan of cities, that that's a shift that has to happen. But at the end of the day, when, you know, that has to come down to individuals making those changes. So when children move to places, a new generation is moving into cities, rehabbing them, taking on projects like the High Line in New York and creating new green spaces where they're not, you know, trying to do this, you know, 5,000-year-old pastoral tradition to move out to green spaces, but they want to move into places that aren't green and green them. You know, that's a personal ethical decision, but that's a new cultural trend, and it's a necessary one, and it's fundamentally different.
Ethical in the value sense, so everybody has a different value for how they perceive the resource.
But everyone has different values, and it's so interesting because so many environmental critics and environmental thinkers want to focus on those different values and different religious systems, different cultural systems and all. And yet in this country, it has worked out in this sort of singular way where we are fascinated with suburbs and we want to go there. In spite of all the other values we bring to the table and all the other things that we have, that becomes something that is part of this American cultural movement. And that's the thing that needs to be sort of countered. Again.
Sort of a mindset too, isn't it? I mean, you're talking about those castles and everything back in London and our McMansions today. It's as if you have control over that piece of land. You are the king of your, or queen of your vote. And we have to change that. I mean, that's just an obvious. If you have a burning leaves on your property, that may affect your neighbor. If you have a flooding situation, that's going to affect your neighbor, and on it goes. And we are so interdependent. But I think that part of our culture, or whatever you want to call it, is gone. I mean, we each have to have a gun. Give me a break. I mean, we have this feeling that we are in control of everything. But we're not. We're all dependent on each other. And of course, we're all converted here, so it's not like...
Yeah, that's true. Well, but you know, it's such a great point, because obviously the biggest challenge we face today is climate change. And, you know, I will not say there's anything good out of it, but one thing that's done is made people think of the interconnectedness, because atmosphere connects. Because we've so often had land ethic, and it's exactly right, you know, this is my piece of land, this is separate, this is place, this is bioregional, whatever. And that is always focused on one particular place. Private property comes out of that, and we always, you know, people have theorized and say, well, how can people work communally? How can we think of that? How do commons work and all? Well, guess what? The atmosphere is a common. It's making us rethink that again. And again, there are no simple, you know, answers to this. I mean, we wish we could go down to Rio and make the decision as to how to do it right. But it's getting worked out, and it's a new kind of ethos that's going to take, it has to work that way. And we have to realize that we're connected in a way that we thought we were discrete and separate before. Yeah, it's a great metaphor for ecology in that sense. Yeah.
One of the problems I see with cities like New York is that it's not convenient for older people or people with difficulties. If you had to walk, if you could walk only one block at a time, it's impossible.
Yeah.
To go to New York City is impossible.
Yeah. No, I mean, mobility is what cars bring. But on the other hand, you know, I actually have friends that live in New York who literally work in the same building they live in. One's a dentist, and he actually is in the same building. And there, you know, you can do it. But I mean, but that is, you know, that's really a question that just has to get resolved with, you know, providing access more than anything else, I think. But I mean, that's absolutely right. Anyhow, Linda.
I think this is a fascinating discussion, and I'm so pleased that so many people had comments and questions, and it really turned into a good discussion. I feel I need to bring it to a conclusion as we hit 8:30, and I wondered if you could conclude, you know, you talked about personal choice. It was brought up in a number of the comments here. And I wonder if you could conclude by telling us, you know, from the many studies you've done, you've looked at all these things. It seems like a little disappointing to me that we just repeat the same cycle over and over again and don't learn from it.
Yeah.
So if you had to identify, say, here's the top 3 lessons that I take from my studies, you know, and I know that might be a little bit hard to do, but I bet you can say, here's 3 things for us to keep in mind as we all go away.
I can narrow it down to 1.
Okay, perfect.
So one thing that we've never really thought about before, and we increasingly think about today, is like our carbon footprint and what that could mean. But increasingly, I think the issue is to think of your footprint in every way, and we don't do that. And increasingly, we have the ability to do that. And there are a number of resources online. I can actually send some to you. There's actually a wonderful book that the author, who's a Cambridge scholar, made available for free online. And what he does is he looks at, for example, transportation, and he will tell you exactly, in terms of energy use, how efficient mass transit is, how efficient a bicycle is, how efficient a car is, how efficient a bus, trolley, whatever. And when you look at those and we become aware of the footprint that we have in every way, that's huge, you know, because we just don't realize it. So I'll end with this. If I were to fly back to California now and make a round trip, the cost of energy to do that would exceed the cost of energy that every human being now has allocated to them on the planet. Just that one trip would do that. And we decide to go traveling all over the place, and we don't realize that we're just, you know, consuming resources at an incredible rate. So I guess the answer would be to be aware of that. I mean, it's a simple thing, but it's maybe I wouldn't make that trip.
Yep.
You know?
But we're glad you did, and then you take care of that. speakers with something to kind of remind you of having been here and shared your wisdom with us. I think this is particularly appropriate for you, probably more so than anyone else I've ever presented it to.
This is great.
Thank you.
And it's made of wood, too.
It's made of wood, and it's
a
a piece of our bark. So thank you so much for being
Okay,
here. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you all. This is really
Isn't
nice.
that fun?
It's actually the barn and then there's a little store in the back. So my desk at TDI.
That's great. That's great. I hadn't seen one of these yet. Hold it up. Oh, that is wonderful.
And it has a story on the back.
Johnson Education Center.
And it's wood.